Welcome to Frank Lloyd Wright, Art of the Home, and we're to acknowledge that the land on which we gather is Treaty 4 territory and the traditional territory of the Cree, the Sultane, the Assiniboine, and the Métis. As an organization whose goal is to share the stories of our past, we are committed to including programming that reflect the rich cultural history of Indigenous people, as well as confronting the impact of destructive government policies on their lives and culture. Frank Lloyd Wright was the infamous American architect who is recognized for revolutionizing the way we design, build, and live in our homes. He brought us the prairie style and contemporary works, including the Usonia style. His highly illustrated presentation will take you on a journey from his earliest projects through his life and renowned career, including a look at his most infamous house, Falling Water, at Bear Run in Pennsylvania. You're going to hear from John Robinson as he tells the history of a brilliant architectural career through stories, drawings, and photos. John Robinson has been in the architectural design and drafting profession since 1977. His interest in historical homes has taken him across North America to better understand the importance of good design. Sit back, get cozy, as we learn about Frank Lloyd Wright.
Welcome to my talk on Frank Lloyd Wright, The Art of Home. Preparing a presentation about the American architect Frank Lloyd Wright has been an interesting process. Some of you know his work quite well and may have toured some of his homes. Frank Lloyd Wright's career spanned 70 years and provided hundreds of homes and commercial buildings. We may not realize it, but as a residential architect, he's created styles and living patterns that affect the way we live today. Given this vast amount of material, it has been challenging to illustrate and explain his work in an hour. I've selected an array of his works, mostly ones I like, so that you can see his unique ideas and compositions. Consider this a taste of his work only, and not a detailed documentary. There are countless books, websites, and even tours that will further explain his ideas and projects. The focus of this presentation is his groundbreaking homes and not his commercial works. There are many stories about the tragedies, romances, and financial problems that always seem to follow him. Tonight I won't be dealing with those. I've done my best to find reliable sources for my information. Many of the details I will be sharing tonight were obtained when touring the various sites. I apologize in advance for the speed with which I'm presenting this material, but I really want to show you all these pictures and stories. When Canada's forefathers of Confederation formalized Confederation of Canada on July 1st, 1867, Frank Lloyd Wright was 3 weeks old. That was 156 years ago. He died at age 92 on April 9th, 1959. That helps put a start to his timeline in perspective. Frank Lloyd Wright was born in Spring Green, Wisconsin, which is just north of Chicago. His father was a minister, an organist, but he never quite provided well enough for the family. His mother decorated his nursery with architectural plates of some of the old masters in architecture. She bought wooden blocks, and she claimed that she knew before he was born that Frank Lloyd Wright was going to be a great architect and he would design great buildings. He went to Chicago as an idealistic. He had little experience, just brief schooling for 1 year at the University of Wisconsin. There weren't architecture schools in those days, so he took engineering, and he lasted 1 year. He came from a staunch Unitarian family on his mom's side, and they believed in powerful, creative expression and questioning thoughts. That was a natural fit for him because he was more of a free spirit than an academic. Frank Lloyd Wright moved to Chicago against the wishes of his mother, and he went to work for the architect J. Lyman Silsby, who had designed the little chapel at the cemetery at Spring Green. This was near the farm where he used to go as a kid in the summer to help on the farm. And that time he spent at that farm shaped his love of nature, but not his love of hard physical work. This architect, J. Lyman Silsby, designed houses in Victorian and Romanesque styles. And that was a little bit of a departure for houses at the time because they were mostly doing Victorian and colonial revival. This little chapel that shows in this picture here is still standing today, and that's where Frank Lloyd Wright was buried for a time. Chicago was an exciting place as there was a lot of building. The Great Chicago Fire, October 8, 1871, destroyed most of the city. Architects came from all across the world to work on what was considered a blank canvas to try new styles. It was a great opportunity for architects, but a very desperate situation for the city. The area that was burned was 100 blocks of buildings, 1 mile by 4 miles wide, where everything was burned. 22 years later, the World Exposition of 1893 was held in Chicago. This was a huge event, and for the summer of 1893, people came from all over the world to see the amazing buildings, exhibits, and latest inventions. One of these was the Ferris wheel. I encourage you to Google this because the World Exposition of 1893, the Columbian Exhibition, it was an incredible event that had railroad lines built to bring people into it. And they had all these buildings that were only designed to be temporary, but they were all very classical. And it was a precursor for what now Disneyland is considered the ultimate theme park. The overall architectural feel of the buildings was Beaux-Arts and classical European styles. This was a World's Fair, and most of these buildings were only temporary. They were built of plaster and wood, and some of them were built of stone, and those are still standing, but most of them were only designed to last for 6 months. These styles that were built for that show offended a lot of American architects who were tired of what was coming from Europe and wanted to see a classic American architectural style. Two of those architects were Louis Sullivan and Dagmar Adler, and they were very forward-thinking. They had just designed the auditorium building in Chicago, which was completed in 1893. This building had 4,300 seats. It sits on one of the first raft slabs and spreads the weight of this building over 100 feet of expansive blue clay. The auditorium building was the tallest, the largest, and the heaviest building in Chicago at the time. It caused a sensation all around the world, and this building is still standing. We toured it about 6 or 7 years ago, and it still uses an auditorium, and there's also a university that operates out of it. Louis Sullivan liked to sketch freehand with natural curving lines and botanical shapes, and he hired Frank Lloyd Wright as a draftsman. Frank Lloyd Wright was all about using his T-square and set squares, and it was all about right angles and the geometric genius that brought to a project. This level of decoration that Louis Sullivan did was very ornate, but it was still considered a skyscraper, and Louis Sullivan was considered the father of the American skyscraper. But while Frank Lloyd Wright was working for Louis Sullivan, he had built his house already and he needed cash, so he was working on the side. And over the next few years, he designed 9 houses, and they were right on the same street that he lived, so it wasn't very much of a secret. These were called the bootleg houses. The first house you see is the Walter Gale house, and that house shows the beginning of Frank Lloyd Wright's work when he was still heavily influenced by the Queen Anne style, like the turret. But what's the departure from the Queen Anne style is the cantilevered veranda in the corner and the strong emphasis on the horizontal lines that tie the windows together. The Thomas Gale house is similar. It's not really a Queen Anne, but it's hard to tell what it is because the overhang is bigger than normal, the roof is very dominant, and again the strong use of horizontal lines. So that was a hint of what was to come down the road. When Louis Sullivan found out what was going on, Frank Lloyd Wright was fired. And they had been very close for all those years they worked together, and it was going to be many years before that relationship would be restored. The first independent commission that Frank Lloyd Wright did was the Winslow House. And again, this is just a few blocks from where he lived. I mean, you think that at the time, most people were going to be building Victorian-style houses or American colonial revival. This would be quite a departure. So you can see how there's a strong emphasis on overhangs, horizontal lines, and notice how short the door is. Frank Lloyd Wright was not a tall man, and we're going to come back throughout this discussion and talk about how that affected what he designed. But this building is still standing. It's amazing. I was in it a few years ago on a tour, and it's in pristine condition. This is 1894. Inside the house, it shows how he was still heavily influenced by classical thinking. And when I first saw this picture, I thought, man, that interior must be huge. Until I saw it in real life and realized that those arches are about 6 feet to the top of them. Because he was shorter and he designed to suit himself, the whole scale of that room is quite funny because it's not as big as you'd think it was. This is the house that Frank Lloyd Wright built for himself and his wife in 1889. It was one of the ones that he had to have a house as soon as he got married, but he didn't have a lot of money, so he went to Louis Sullivan, and Louis Sullivan lent him the money. It was started in 1889, and the playroom addition came along 6 years later, and then in 1897, the office addition came on. The house shows some English arts and crafts influence, and at that time for him, he had a large family, he lived there 22 years, and there was no separation of office life and home life. So he split up with his wife and went to Europe, and it basically left the family and went to Europe to work on a manuscript of all his projects to date. This is the office elevation that faces Chicago Avenue. This house, you can see, is very eclectic because it was his laboratory for trying different designs and styles. When he left Catherine and the children, they had no income, and so the office portion was turned into apartments to generate revenue. Later on, like 30 years ago, that was all restored and rebuilt back to the state it was when he left. You can see the inside pictures of this house, how classical his thinking was when he first started out. Like the decorative cornice in the hallway. And one thing I should mention too is that the chairs around the dining room table he designed, he was more concerned about how they'd make you feel than how they'd make you feel to sit on them. So they were apparently comfortable, but what the notion was, those chairs would make a room within a room. And so because the backs are so high, they'd come around and envelop the table, and it would be quite cozy. You can see how in the picture in the hallway there, by the stairs, he's got leaded glass in the window. And that's before he got into using stained glass. And that was his way of just filtering and screening that light. This is the living room of that house. Again, you can see how un-Frank Lloyd Wright it looks. What we think of as Frank Lloyd Wright. It's very classical and very formal. The ingle look that you see on the left is again the notion of a room within a room, and it'd be a cozy little spot to sit by the fire. This is the playroom, and I always saw pictures of this room, and I thought, it looks like a gymnasium. It's so big. But again, it's to the deceiving scale that does it. If I was in that room, I'd have to bend over to look out the windows. The room is actually quite small, but he knew the end users were going to be children. The room could be smaller, and it just had to fit the children. This notion of scale was very important to him, and that's how he achieved that. This is a drafting room, and the upper balcony is suspended by cables for support. And that would have been quite unusual at that time. Typically, things were stacked on top of one another. And in this case, the whole structure acted as these cables with chains that went around the perimeter to support that. This is what was made into suites, and then was later opened up again and back and restored into an office. Just down the street from Frank Lloyd Wright's house was the Thomas House. This was another house that was very popular, and it was published at the time and written in magazines. And one of the unusual things about this house was he wanted the house to turn its back on the street And so that when you were in the house, it was quite private. So basically, the living area was raised up almost a story off the floor. And you can see how the broad chimney at the back above the roof anchors it, and the plan kind of revolves around that. Frank Lloyd Wright had a notion that if you didn't live there or were a friend or member of the family, you had no real need to know where the door was. And so he played down his front doors. Quite often they're on the side of the house, sometimes they're around behind a wall, but you can see how the door is hidden. The Arthur Hurtley house, again, is just a few doors down from that one. And this one also has the living areas on the second floor. The idea there was you leave the cares of the world behind you when you climb the stairs to go home. This is one of his earlier works, 1902, and you can see how he was already embracing that strong horizontals. There's the roof line, there's the balcony, and there's the low wall at the front patio. He has recessed some of the brick and projected some of the other brick to get even more horizontals. And you can see again how he's got that curved arch at the door, which is really more of a Richardson Romanesque feature than a Prairie feature. It was thought that the prow windows on the main floor reflected Mr. Hurtley's love of sailing. The arched doorway is really a unique feature and quite a departure from all the straight angular lines. On the top floor, you can see the windows have stained glass. And stained glass was something that Frank Lloyd Wright did because it was a way to introduce a motif that he'd come up with for each house and work it through the house. So in this case, the skylights have some stained glass in them with that pattern. But when they were in windows, he would call them light screens. The largest house that Frank Lloyd Wright did was the Darwin Martin House in Buffalo. This was 1904. It was designed for Darwin Martin, who was the secretary of the Larkin Soap Building. And it started out as a whole block, a city block, where he would be able to build houses for his family. They were orphaned as children, and family was very important to them, and he wanted to keep them all together. And so he started out with his own main house. It got away on him. And Frank Lloyd Wright was constantly coming up with all these great ideas to test all these theories he had, and he finally had a client that could afford it. So like I said, this was a whole city block, and it was quite spread out, and the buildings were connected. At the bottom of the screen, that larger brown square was the main house. There was a covered canopy that went all the way to the back, and it terminated in a conservatory. To the left, we had the carriage house, which was basically where the horse and carriage would stay. To the left of that, it's not shown, was the gardener's house. And to the right was the house he had built for his sister. Since that time, they've also built a reception center on the site where if you're going there for a tour, you would watch a video and see panels that explain the story of the family and the house. This is the living room. This house and conservatory have recently been restored at a cost of $50 million US. So when this house was first built, it was extremely detailed. The brick, the millwork, the windows, and when situations changed for Darwin Martin, the bank foreclosed on the house, and it sat empty for a few years. In that time, vandals came in and really did a lot of damage. The house was built using, for a facade brick, Roman brick. Roman brick is it's shorter, longer, and it's a different shape than a regular brick, and they could no longer get it. So any bricks that had to be repaired, they had to cut down new bricks. The glass mosaic tile artwork over the fireplace had been destroyed by renters or else vandals. Nobody really knew. And they didn't know what they were going to do, but they had seen pictures of this beautiful plant-based design. And when the workmen were cleaning out the ashes in the fireplace, they found a few of the tiles, and that gave them enough of the colors to know what they needed to do to have it all rebuilt. This picture shows the painted vertical mortar joints, custom light fixtures, and stained glass. It's no wonder this house was over budget by many times. And I've read a book about the letters that Darwin Martin used to write to Frank Lloyd Wright, telling him that the house was way out of control. And there was never a response from Frank Lloyd Wright, just more details. But you can see in this picture at the brick, the vertical joints are filled and painted, and the horizontal joints of the brick are raked, again to get more shadows and more sense of horizontal. Custom-built furniture was what this house was all about. Every piece of furniture was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it was usually built of white quarter-cut oak. And when I look at this picture, I think, at that time, what my grandparents were living in and what maybe all of our grandparents were living in, and it really was a luxurious house. This is the dining room, again, with custom furniture, and the ceiling changes from room to room, and what that does, it shows where one room ends in theory and another room starts. And if you notice the little holes on the ends of the dining room table, that's because sometimes they would bring in light fixtures that locked onto the table, and again would give that notion of a room within a room with these huge big light fixtures that towered over the table. The Tree of Life window that you see there above the stairs was what the theme of the house was. This house had 394 windows, and some of those windows had 750 pieces of glass. And all the caning wasn't lead like it would be nowadays. It was all bronze. So you can think what that budget would have been for that subtrade alone. This is a conservatory that was rebuilt. Now, when the place was abandoned, the conservatory was torn down, the carriage house was torn down, and they put 4 apartment blocks in the backyard. So when the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation took this property over, those were removed, and they started the process of rebuilding what was there. So the statue you see there is Nike, and Frank Lloyd Wright used her in quite a few of his designs. You'll see she'll be showing up again in a few minutes. The building on the left here is the carriage house, and it doesn't look like most carriage houses would look at that time. The second floor is actually a suite for the carriage driver, and currently that's used as a gift shop, that building. The picture right beside it is a colonnade walking from the house to the conservatory. Just an incredible space. Frank Lloyd Wright was especially fond of this project, and he called it his opus. And for 50 years, he kept the drawings for this house on the walls of his office. This is a George and Delta Barton house on the site, and it was a house that he built for his sister. And even after he lost his house, she continued to live there. And this house was never modified, it was never torn down, and it's now been restored as well, and it's used for receptions and tours. The last house on the site is the gardener's cottage, and this is a really nice cottage. It's very similar to some of his later works. It's been restored and been added on to, and it's now part of the tours on the site. If you're ever in Buffalo, this house is worth going to see. It takes a few hours to get through the tour, but it's absolutely incredible, and it's like something you'll never see before. So that house reminds me of this house. And so in the April of 1907, the Ladies' Home Journal had a contest, and they wanted to see who could build the most amazing house that could then become a mainstream house for farm families and urban families as well. So Frank Lloyd Wright, worried about the rash of fires that had been going on, designed what he called a fireproof house for $5,000. The idea would be it would be concrete, warm in winter, cool in summer, and perfect for a young American family. But the problem was the cost. This house cost a lot more than a wood frame house that was his competition. He won the competition, but there was only a few of them built, about a dozen, and they were built with wood frame and stucco, which looked the same as his concrete house, but it turned out being quite a bit cheaper. This building is what really kicked off his prairie-style homes all across the U.S. This is the Roby House. It was built in Hyde Park, just south of Chicago, and this house was radical at the time, and it's still radical now. It was built with wild cantilevers. This was one of the first houses he did that used steel. So with the steel, he was able to get these cantilevers, and that allowed him to get even more horizontals, and not just regular horizontals. These are wild horizontals. He oversized the moldings on the top of the wall, the brick caps, the stone caps, and he made the windows in long continuous bands. In the base of the wall, he's got a really exaggerated stone base, and the overhangs are also another strong horizontal which create a shadow. You entered the house on the lowest level, and the door to this house is hard to find. It's around the back. And the intent was that once you step inside into this foyer that's very low and dark, you felt very cozy and warm and very safe. From that room, you stepped up a few steps to the living room, and you're in this huge space, and that made it feel even bigger because you come from something so small. He called this compression and release. This is the dining room with stained glass light screens and built-in furniture. The windows lined up with the lines on the ceiling, the lighting lined up with the lines on the ceiling, and everything came across looking very controlled. Notice how the table with the lights again gives you the room within a room. The design he has in the windows of this house would also be worked into carpets, and any opportunity he had to work that motif into the house. This is the living room. Again, like I said, Frank Lloyd Wright designed the carpets. He would also design any window coverings, and he would even design the gown that the lady of the house would wear for the grand opening of the house. And if you were to invite him to your house, and he walked in and saw you had moved a chair from where he had designed it, or moved a picture where he had designed it, if you left the room, you come back and he would have it back the way he intended it. This house was designed for privacy, even though it was on a busy street. So by elevating it and having a low wall outside around the balcony, you could be sitting in the living room with those huge windows and still not be seen from the street. This slide is included because I thought it was a really good example of how horizontal lines and trim work in the inside and the outside. This is the Emil Bach house, and it was in Chicago, built in 1915, and has recently been restored, and you can actually stay in this house. It's open for tours a couple of days a week. But you can see how in the inside of the house, all those horizontals tie things together. So it's what it looks like it's an open plan, but it's all really quite connected. This is a Lower Gale house, and this house again is in Oak Park. And again, look how radical these balconies are and overhangs when you consider what was being built at the time. The house next door is probably a Victorian style house, which has got, typical walls, roof, and floor. And then this house here comes up next door. But that house is 113 years old now, and it's still open for tours. Frank Lloyd Wright had an interest in Japanese buildings, and he collected art his whole life from Japan. And he developed that at the Columbian Exhibition when he saw the Japanese pavilion. And so, before long, he was shortlisted for the Imperial Hotel. He visited Japan in 1905 and started what was to be a long construction process over there building this hotel. It was completed in 1923. Unbelievably, the day of the opening, there was an earthquake, and most of the city was destroyed, and especially the area around this building. But this building, he got a telegram from Japan saying, city leveled, hotel standing straight. Because he'd worked out the structure of this with his engineers to withstand the earthquake. Unfortunately, it couldn't withstand a wrecking ball because it was destroyed later on, and it's gone now. This building has obviously Mayan influences, which was something that he was also dabbling in at the time. I'm going to show you another house in a minute with that. This is a picture of the hotel. There's not a lot of them around, but in 1968, as I said, it was demolished, but he was able to, the foundation was able to convince them to keep the lobby and build it and save it as a restaurant. It was built out of brick and oya, which is a local volcanic lava rock. But you can see how he has a different aesthetic that we would normally have at that time, and he just had a mind that just didn't quit. When Frank Lloyd Wright returned to Chicago from Europe, he was unpopular. His romantic escapades and the fact that he'd abandoned his wife and children had kind of turned people off him, and he knew it. And so he wanted to retreat to the country. So he went back to Spring Green, and in 1911 decided he was going to build a cottage for himself and his mother. That's the story he told people. And so he was able to convince friends and family. He had no money. He was able to convince them to help him fund this little farm estate. This project he called Taliesin, and it turned into a large project because he ended up building a studio office, staff quarters, and a farm building. It was to be the country home for him and Mamah Borthwick Cheney, who had joined him in for his 2 years in Europe. Just a bit of history there is he had designed a house for her and her husband in Oak Park in 1904. The estate had carefully groomed gardens and artwork. It was a showplace for people wanting to see the love nest of Frank Lloyd Wright and his mistress. It was also a place for them to see all the really cool ideas he had, that as long as people were giving him money to build this, he just kept building. But tragedy struck at noon on August 15th, 1914. After serving the noon meal, the cook/butler, who had been told that his services were no longer required, served the noon meal and then murdered Mama and her 2 children who were visiting. He then proceeded to kill 4 of the workers after setting fire to the house. So you can imagine that night, Frank Lloyd Wright and Mama's husband took the train out from Chicago and tried to see what they could salvage from this situation. Frank Lloyd Wright was devastated, and it affected him for the rest of his life. He did rebuild. He started right away, and he called this one Taliesin II. But without his soulmate, there was no joy in it. The prairie style died the same time, and he looked for other building materials and methods. This site is open for tours. The whole compound is, and it's, again, at Spring Green. And a lot of people say they've been to Taliesin, but there's a Taliesin in Phoenix as well. But this one here is the original Taliesin. Catalog home companies were soon offering homes in prairie style. These were a lot less expensive than having Frank Lloyd Wright design you a custom house. And that price that you see there of $2,740 isn't the plans, that's the lumber package. So that's pretty mind-boggling. In the next few years, Frank Lloyd Wright started projects in California. The second one was the Aileen Barnsall House, and this is in Hollywood. It's still standing, it's been recently restored, and he called it Hollyhock. And he took that Hollyhock motif again, put it wherever he could in that house. And this house opens into a courtyard in the middle, and it's up on the top of the hill, and it's an amazing sight. The living room was a complex room, and it had a moat that came in it and came around the fireplace and went back out the other side. And so if you wanted to put wood in the fireplace or have someone put wood in the fireplace, they'd have to jump across that moat, put the logs in, and then jump back over. It wasn't unusual as well to see ducks coming in one side of the house, go swimming through the moat and out the other. But she didn't like this house. The lady, Aileen Barnsall, stayed in it one night, said, "I will never spend another night in that house," and she donated it to the city. And since that time, it's been open as an art retreat place, and now it's open for tours. It's been all totally restored. So after the completion of the Imperial Hotel, Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to experiment with concrete block. Well, this isn't your average concrete block that we have now. He called it textile block because looking from a distance, it looked like brocade and it looked like it was woven. So what he would do is he would come up with a shape for every house, and it'd be a unique block, and that, again, would be carried right through the whole house. Frank Lloyd Wright saw it as an utterly modern and democratic expression of his organic architecture. He took what he considered to be an ugly material and tried to create beauty out of it. The textile block houses were named, again, because of the brocade, and from a distance you may not really see that concrete, that textured look, but he always called it his textured block. The concrete was poured in molds, and if it had a window in it, the glass would be poured into the mold as well. The public laughed at him for this house at the time, but now it's considered one of his greatest works. The John Storer House is another one that's still standing in LA. Again, and it's got that Mayan-inspired concrete textile block. John Lloyd Wright, Frank Lloyd Wright's son, supervised construction. Each of these houses, as you can see, had a lot of work put into to design the initial block that they then copied throughout the whole house. The concrete blocks provided rich texture on the interior as well. And look who's standing on top of the wall there. That's the Nike statue again that we had seen in the Darwin Martin house. The Innes house was built in 1924 and is the largest of the textile block houses. It was built high on a hill in LA, and you can see it from quite a ways. Again, the Mayan influence is evident, and there's been 20 movies shot on this house. One of them was Blade Runner. This house was sold in 2018 for $23 million. When it was restored in 2006, a condition of the funding was they had to be open to the public 12 days each year. This is an interesting idea, and I think it's one that we could be looking at here. It's a great way to fund heritage properties, but make other people can enjoy them as well. Some blocks were detailed and some were smooth. But this house is notable because it was the last time Frank Lloyd Wright used stained glass in a house. The Samuel Freeman house in Los Angeles was the one where he used mitered glass in the corners. When we toured Taliesin in Wisconsin, I saw the very same mitered glass that he was experimenting with at the same time. It wasn't a complex detail, it was just 2 pieces of glass butted together on the corner. Again, this house has got various types of blocks, smooth and quite decorative. This is some interior pictures of that house, and you can see how there's a certain transparency to the walls and a certain heaviness as well. In 1929, Frank Lloyd Wright was asked to assist Albert MacArthur, who was a former apprentice of his, to design a hotel in Phoenix. This was to be an amazing hotel, but the apprentice made it quite clear that Frank Lloyd Wright was not the principal architect. He was there to help him. So he didn't get a lot of say, but he did have an influence. And this is one where they used textile block, and even the landscaping details you notice, they have some of the sprites from the Midway Gardens. It was an amusement park that Frank Lloyd Wright did in Chicago years before. Frank Lloyd Wright didn't want rectangular blocks. He wanted square, but the ones they ended up with were rectangular. But this building is an amazing building because it's open now. You can go to Phoenix and walk through this lobby, and it's again been very well taken care of. Some of the blocks were almost acting like a vent. They were designed to have the air go through them, and so those are quite suddenly worked into the detail of the wall. The picture that you see there was a design that Frank Lloyd Wright came up with for the cover of a magazine in 1926, and his students in 1973 that were at his school had that window installed in the Biltmore Hotel. This is another example of one of the different blocks that they used, and a picture of what the interior spaces are like. It's quite unreal. This was the first Usonian home Frank Lloyd Wright built. And in 1936, we were in the middle of the Depression. There wasn't a lot of money. People were unemployed, and people couldn't afford the big houses they did before the Depression. So the idea here was a house could be smaller, but still very nice and elegant. They had some fairly unique features that tied all these different house styles together, and there were 100 of them built across the U.S. These homes were usually brick with flat or monoslope roofs, and they were private to the street, and then the back would be opened up into glass. All the ones of these that I've seen, they're all in fairly moderate climates. There's a lot of glass, and it's all single glazed glass. And so these were primarily homes built in the southern U.S. Wood was used extensively instead of plaster and stucco. And again, the horizontal lines were really common, and they were a big part of the house inside and out. They were built on a concrete slab. Frank Lloyd Wright did not like basements, and so the concrete slab was able to have radiant heating in it, and that was what kept these houses warm to make up for the fact they had so much glass. Long linear spaces allowed rooms to get light and ventilation. So if you think about the most efficient shape of a house is a rectangle, then you look at this house, there's a very stretched out L-shaped house. So there were some economies that weren't taken advantage of, but they were more important to him to have the light and the access into a private backyard. Most of the back of the house was all doors on this house. So again, I was talking about the horizontal lines. He did not frame these houses with 2x4s vertically like we do nowadays. He would turn a 2x4 flat and put one every 4 feet. Then on either side of that, he'd put like a 1x10 board, and then cover the joints of that with another board. So what you got was every foot or so, you get these wide bands all around the house. And he'd make that band, everything lined up with those bands. The bookshelves would line up with those, the bed would line up with those, even tables and night tables would line up with those horizontal bands. Everything was planned. These houses quite often had lap siding on the ceiling. And again, ceilings and ceiling changes are what defined where a room would change to another room. I toured this house several years ago. It's in Florence, Alabama. It's a Rosenbaum house, and it's an amazing house in the sense that it's very human scaled. It doesn't have high lofty ceilings, but it's got so much glass that draws your eye out horizontally. It's got a low flat roof, and again, strong horizontal lines everywhere around the house. Serious cantilever at the carport here. That's the one thing I was amazed at. But again, he was using steel by now, and so it was quite easy to do. I don't think Alabama gets the snow loads that we do here, so that probably helps too. The street view is very private on this house and almost unassuming. Like if you didn't know that was a house, you wouldn't even know to look for somebody living there. The buildings, he laid out his Usonia houses in 2-foot by 4-foot grids, and his favorite color, if he was going to paint something, it was going to be Cherokee red. So in this case, the floor is Cherokee red, and it would have heating pipes embedded in it. The fireplace is very simple and clean lines, and when he would build these houses, he would design the furniture as well. And somehow he would come up with a different design for a chair for each house, which is amazing in the fact that not just the house is unique, but the furniture is unique. See, this is a picture that shows how the bookshelves line up to give those horizontals. And so it wasn't a case of going to a store and buying a bookshelf and putting it on the wall. Everything was built in, so you really didn't need a lot of furniture in these houses because everything was built to be lived in, and it was like a piece of art to live in it. Here's one that shows you how the table even lines up with the height on the walls. I got a funny story about this house. Was they were saying that when we toured it, that the father sat at the end of the table, the 4 boys sat in the middle, and the woman sat at the end, the mother, staring into the wall. I just thought, wow, that's interesting. So this is a house that, in Frank Lloyd Wright standards, would have a huge kitchen. He called kitchens workspaces, and they weren't designed to be entertaining or social. They were meant to get the job done. And so this one is a little bigger than normal. Quite often, like this one, they were in the middle of the house and had no windows, but they would have a skylight. Even in the bathroom, the horizontal lines come through into the plan, and again, there's a skylight there as well. The Pope Lay house was built in 1940 in Virginia, and again, this is one where he took that idea of a shape and worked it into as many things as he could. You notice the plan again is very linear and is stretched out so that there's lots of opportunity for doors and glass into the backyard. So you can see here those cutout shapes. He'd moved away from the shapes that he'd put into stained glass and repeat over and over and over, and instead got out his jigsaw and would jigsaw these wooden designs into any opportunity he had to do that. It's a lot cheaper than stained glass, but they still brought in light and could filter the light as well. Again, this shows you how the ceiling heights were varied from room to room and how the spaces flowed, but they still had a sense of where the dining room ended and where the living room started. So another picture that shows the wood screens and on the side where you might want to filter the view, and the backyard where it's wide open, there's not even window coverings. The Tompkins house was built in Cincinnati in 1954, so this is one of his later houses. And even though it looks like a textile block house, it's actually considered a Usonian design because it uses concrete block. This house has 492 windows, which, if you think about it, that's quite a lot. The Tompkins house used a much simpler block, but he's found a way to use it in the ceilings and roof as well. Frank Lloyd Wright's grandson, Eric, supervised this house, and they promised the clients they would build this house for $25,000. It came in at $118,000. Frank Lloyd Wright died right after the house was completed. I always have to go back and read. It was coincidence, but anyway, it was that's quite an overage, like almost 5 times the price that you were quoted. But it's an amazing house. This is the Gordon House in Oregon, and it was going to be demolished because it was in the way for a new building, and so the government bought it and moved it into a park, and now it's open for tours. But this house, again, was built after Frank Lloyd Wright died, and it was designed in 1957 when he was alive. He died 2 years later. So here again, you can see how they've got this, what looks almost like a saw profile, and worked that into screens and walls wherever they could. It's not a big house. It's got a lot of windows and doors and a lot of openings to outside, which makes it feel bigger. So this is the living room. And that couch is really comfortable because I was at this house listening to a lecture about the design of the house, and I fell asleep. It was cold out, and I'd been cold, and it was a terribly rainy day. Went inside, it was nice and warm, sitting by the fire, and I didn't have a chance. But you can see again the red Cherokee floor, the pink color, and all the light that filters through the house. This is the outside, and Frank Lloyd Wright designed this house to have wild cantilevers, as he did. But when they moved it and renovated it, they chickened out and put 2 columns underneath that one veranda there on the right-hand side on the deck, which is really too bad because you can see how that takes away some of the mystery of the structure when you see that happening. But this is a beautiful house, again, open for tours. This is considered Frank Lloyd Wright's most famous house. It's called Falling Water, and it's probably the one that's been photographed the most of any house in the U.S. It was built for the Kaufmans, who wanted a weekend home where they had land, where they could go and watch and be around the waterfall that graced their property. There's a lot of stone outcroppings, And they wanted to have a cabin where they could sit in there and see the waterfall. So they talked to Frank Lloyd Wright, and 9 months later, they still hadn't heard anything. So Edgar Kaufman phones him up and says, "We're on our way up. We'll be there in 2 hours." So you can imagine what was going on in that office in that 2 hours, because when they showed up 2 hours later, Frank Lloyd Wright unrolled the plans he had sketched up for them, and they fell in love with it. It was not what they wanted, though, originally. They wanted to sit and look at the waterfall. He had them living on top of and in the waterfall. And so that there again, just like the Darwin Martin house, crazy price overruns and a complicated structure, but in the end, they had a very happy client who had an amazing house. This is the north side where you enter, and again, notice how he's hidden the door under the carport, and that's how you get into the house. To the left of this picture is the main house, and to the right is the guest house. Frank Lloyd Wright coined the phrase organic architecture, and to different architects, that means different things. Like to Louis Sullivan, it meant form follows function, and that's how he explained that tall buildings, it's okay for them to look tall. To Frank Lloyd Wright, though, it meant that everything in the building, materials, motifs, and building forms, must relate to each other and repeat throughout the building, each contributing to the complete composition. Some of these forms are reflecting the spirit of nature, and Frank Lloyd Wright truly believed that the site would be better once his building was on it than the way it was planned. The site was developed originally through nature. This house has a lot of glass, and the reason for that is because the weight of the structure isn't on the outside wall. It's a beam and column system in what we would now call a curtain wall system. There's no weight on the exterior walls, and the windows were all steel frames. Prior to building this house, the Kaufmans liked to sit by the waterfall, and they'd suntan on these big rocks. So Frank Lloyd Wright built the house around those rocks, and they formed the hearth of the fireplace. The large red kettle that you see there on the left swings out in front and over top of the fire, and it's for warming mulled wine. Most of the furnishings are built in. The floor is stone over a concrete structure, and the ceilings are low and stepped. And again, these ceiling changes identify when things happen under certain areas and certain heights. But he's still on this horizontal line mode where he's got all those horizontal lines built into the coving around the fireplace, and any opportunity he can. So they wanted to be able to still swim in the water that was by the waterfall. So he designed a series of steps that came down from the living room, and they could then jump into the stream and then go back up. And that's how they'd start their day every day. And this is the sliding glass doors that are at the top of the stairs. So there wasn't really a door and then going down there. It was these sliding windows that you would then go down, open up, and go down to the waterfall. Because that way he wanted them to be able to live in the waterfall and not look at the waterfall. And that had its downsides too, because one year there was a jam when the spring runoff happened. The logs piled up below the house, jammed the ice, and all the water came up into the living room. But there's still an amazing thing to be able to just go from the living room downstairs to a stream. The windows that you see in this picture are in the kitchen, and they basically are a corner window that opens out. The glass, he didn't want to see a frame where the glass meets the stone, so he described the glass to the stone, and the windows go from floor to ceiling. And just think what a departure that is from what was being built at that time. Even the fireplace, he didn't want to just do a flat fireplace. He wanted the stone outcroppings that are on the site to be carried into the house and that look as well in the fireplace. This is those kitchen windows I was telling you about where they swing out and they meet at the corner, which you wouldn't normally do. But it opened up the corner, and was this whole notion of breaking the box. This building is open for tours, and if you're never around that area, it's in Pittsburgh, it's worth going to see for sure. So Frank Lloyd Wright had his college in Taliesin in Wisconsin, but the winters were horrible, and they had a hard time keeping the buildings warm. So he had an interesting concept when it came to teaching school, because he would get apprentices to sign up, and they would spend their year working alongside sub-trades, pouring cement, working in the gardens, looking after the animals, and then maybe a few nights a week they'd sit at his feet and hear a lecture on architecture. So when he built the one in Taliesin in Phoenix, he decided that he wanted to come up with a unique building form that suited the stone and the climate of Arizona. So he made a form for concrete, filled it full of rocks, poured concrete, and then just as the concrete was almost set, he'd take the forms off and start smashing the concrete away. So he got the look almost like of a ruin, but it became the whole aesthetic and in a way the motif of Taliesin. So if you're ever in Phoenix, there's several different tours you can take of this building. There's a shelter tour, then there's the main building tour, there's a whole day tour, and it's an incredible way to hear the story about what was going on over the years that he built this building. When he died in 1959, he was still spending his winters at Taliesin. So he didn't want to just do a house that looked like a regular house at Taliesin. So he came up with these series of, they started out as canvas tents, and then they went to steel and glass. But that became the look of what is now considered to be Taliesin. The apprentices would live there with him in the winter months. And then later on, the school started running full time. Even after his death, the school ran. And just in the last few years, they've no longer offered classes there. The building's open for tours. So Frank Lloyd Wright wanted to be in on that whole thing of catalog homes as well. And in 1957, he found a builder that wanted some designs made. So he designed some houses that could be shipped in a box and put together on the site. And there was 11 of them built. They've rebuilt some of them. We toured one a few years ago. And they were really what was going to become the mainstay of what a mid-century modern ranch-style bungalow would look like. You can see how he's still in love with horizontal lines. And even the window lines, everything is all quite horizontal. Frank Lloyd Wright designed 3 buildings in Canada, but only one in Western Canada. And that was in 1914. He designed a building in Banff, and it was designed as a pavilion for putting on skates or skis, warming up. And it was a building that was 100 feet by 50 feet. And you can see how horizontal it is. It almost has the same roof line as the Roby House. It was built of wood and stone. It didn't last very long. It was built in 14, and in 1938 it flooded. And there was no appetite to try to drain the site and for it to happen again, and so they demolished it 5 years later. So can you imagine if this building was still standing, what a thing that would be. But now there's a group of architects and citizens in Calgary that are fighting to see this design rebuilt. Not sure it's the same location, but it's just such an amazing building. He did 2 other buildings in Canada. One was in Ontario, and I don't have the details on it. It was built in 1900, so it was very early. He did a renovation in 1906 in Montreal, but that building has been demolished. So how did Frank Lloyd Wright influence what we have for home options in Regina? He didn't design any houses here, but architects and designers have taken his ideas and put it into their own spin, and many times in eclectic ways, to get the prairie-style look. So this house that you see here is on Albert Street, and this house to me has always felt very prairie, because A, the roof line, the large overhangs, strong horizontals, the strong horizontals of the brick on the veranda. But the thing that's a departure from Frank Lloyd Wright with this house would be the type of windows he used. Frank Lloyd Wright hated single-hung windows. He called them guillotine windows, and he preferred a casement window. But this is a very interesting house. This one is right next door. And this one has got a cottage roof. It's got some strong brown horizontal lines that again reinforce that aesthetic, which tie the windows together. Clifford Weens owned this house, and he built the wall in front of this house for privacy. But even that is a strong horizontal, and the little red tiles in it on a straight line are another subtle horizontal line. This iconic College Avenue house and garage has the bones of a prairie-style house. It's got the strong base, the big roof overhang, horizontal trim lines, and some brick. Where it kind of departs from there and takes an eclectic look is the Italianate brackets and then the window style. But it definitely has the massing of a prairie-style house. So it's kind of fun to drive around and look at these houses and see if you could figure out what the inspiration of them was. And a prairie-style one is a pretty easy one to do. Simple flat-roofed houses in Regina can thank Frank Lloyd Wright for making it okay for a house to look kind of boxy. His Usonia homes had flat roofs and walls of glass. And this one here, the door is quite hidden. And so sometimes you can see those influences, but they're quite subtle. Regina has a lot of 1950 ranch-style homes in Hillsdale and Lakeview. And many of them are good examples of low-slung roofs, the long horizontal bands of windows close to the ground. And these were built because that's a fairly affordable style to build per square footage. And those styles in the 1950s were being promoted by Better Homes and Gardens and different magazines. And that's why we see so many of them. Frank Lloyd Wright's ideals can guide us not just in the city. This is a cottage that we did. And you can see how it's got strong horizontal lines. It fits into the hill instead of being on the hill, and has continuous bands of windows. And again, some of those things don't necessarily cost a lot more. It's just a different way of thinking of the design. So what have we learned from Frank Lloyd Wright? Well, one of the main things is that buildings are influenced and dependent on their surroundings and landscape, in both materials and form. The huge cantilevers of falling water reflect his interpretation of the rustic stone outcroppings he saw on his first visit. And it's amazing how you can take that away from your first visit and build a house around it. In order to be truly creative, you have to be able to look beyond the European classic orders and styles and look to nature. Frank Lloyd Wright embodied change and set out to create a uniquely American style. This is the Lewis Spring House in Tallahassee, Florida, and it's the most boat-looking house I've ever seen. I almost got into this house, but it was closed the day we were there. But I'm sure it's pretty amazing inside. Frank Lloyd Wright says human scale is the only scale of architecture, and it should not be confused with size. Human scale means the house makes the human being feel right in that size, and the size suits the purpose of the room. This is the Seth Peterson cottage. It's in Wisconsin. This is one of my favorite houses of all time. But you can see how it's got a lot of style without being lofty and grand. Frank Lloyd Wright went to great lengths to get his buildings to conform to his vision of the exterior. This building form usually provided a strong sense of shelter and protection. The notion of compression and release when you enter a building took this inside as well. So quite often when we design a house, we start with a floor plan. He would not do that. He would know in his head before he started what the look and the feel of that house was going to be. Frank Lloyd Wright coined the phrase organic architecture and what it means. To him it meant the plan and the look and the materials, the motifs, everything was cohesive and everything fit. And that's so important when we look at his designs, when you see how different parts of the house fit together so well and fit with the site as well. And they may be a unique style, it may be a unique shape, but it works in that situation. For more information about Frank Lloyd Wright, you can visit the foundation. And there's a lot of websites. All these houses that I've shown you here today, they can all be searched online. And there's incredible photos of them all. There's videos, there's YouTubes. There's over 1,000 houses that were designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in his lifetime. And it would take a lot of talks to cover all those. So I picked the ones that I thought were the best cross-section of his work. Frank Lloyd Wright said, "The mother of art is architecture. Without an architecture of our own, we have no soul of our own civilization." Thank you for watching this story about the genius and works of Frank Lloyd Wright. I hope you've enjoyed experiencing some of his most notable works and some of my favorites. Thank you.
And a big thank you to John Robinson, who took on the task of researching and documenting what you heard tonight. You can check us out for further information and times for upcoming lectures on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, heritageregina.ca.